everybody. Welcome to today's forum. My name is Gabby. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley the Hinckley Institute reveals current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is titled Bills, 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 the 2024 legislative session, and we're excited to be joined by some great panelists. Representative Jefferson Moss has represented the people of Saratoga Springs, Lehigh, and Eagle Mountain in the legislature since 2017 and serves as the majority leader in the Utah House of Representatives. With a rich history of public service, Representative Moss served on the Utah State Board of Education and the Saratoga Springs City Council and Planning Commission. He formerly served as an assistant vice president of the Central Advancement at UVU and the COO for the UVU Foundation. He currently works with the Utah System of Higher Education as the Points Innovation District Project Director. Representative Angela Romero was first elected to the Utah State Legislature in 2012 and has served as minority leader since the beginning of last year. A longtime community organizer, Representative Romero has worked to advance the progressive causes, equality, and social justice in her community. Outside her legislative capacity, Representative Romero works with local government, overseeing community programs and initiatives in the Division of Youth and Family Programs, including supervising the Youth City Government Program and My Brother's Keeper. Representative Romero is dedicated to ensuring youth have access to political process and civic engagement. Senator Ann Milner serves as the state senator for District 5, which covers parts of Davis, Morgan, and Weber County. She is the Senate Majority Whip and chair of the Senate Ethics Committee. Senator Milner is a Regents Professor of Health Administration and former president at Weber State University from 2002 to 2012. Under her leadership, Weber State became a multi-campus institution, experiencing a nearly 40% enrollment increase, initiated a major facilities revitalization effort, expanded its network of community partnerships, and earned national recognition for its undergraduate research and community-based learning initiatives. In the legislature, she has sponsored legislation focused on economic development, specifically related to commercialization of new technologies and workforce preparation, public and higher education, and victims' rights. Senator Luz Escamilla was first elected in 2008, becoming the first Latina elected to the Utah State Senate and first immigrant elected to the Utah State Legislature. Senator Escamilla currently serves as the Senate Minority Leader. Prior to her legislative service, she was appointed by Governor Jon Huntsman and is first director of the State Office of Ethnic Affairs. She also worked as vice president for Zions Bank in the Community Development Group, and recently she co-founded Escatic Solutions, which enhances customer experiences through technology and artificial intelligence. She has served in many capacities in different boards of nonprofit organizations and other agencies. Today's panel will be moderated by Jason Perry, Vice President of Government Relations and the Director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics at the University of Utah. Jason has worked extensively to policymakers at the local, state, and federal level. Prior to his work at the U, Jason served as the Chief of Staff for Governor Gary Herbert. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Well, thank you, Gabby, and thank you all for being here today. As you gathered from those great intros, this is the leadership of our legislature, the majority and minority party. These are the people who are helping to set policy for the whole state of Utah, and I've missed seeing you all every day. For 45 days, I got to see them all, and some of you, around the room.
I think you missed a day.
I might have missed one day. I'm sure something was happening. In fact, I noticed around the room, so we have a bunch of your legislative interns in this room. Do you recognize it? Raise your hand if you were a legislative intern this session. I think this is amazing because some of you in this room that don't know about this, you do have the opportunity to be, for the entire legislative session, an intern for one of these legislators, and it is an experience unlike any other you will have in your whole educational experience. So please come see us next year. The topic of today, this forum, was bills, 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 and I thought that was interesting because you passed a new record. 591 bills passed, beating the record for last year of 575. How'd you do that? I mean, how are you getting through that many bills? Senator Milner, you've been in the legislature for a little while, so it seems like
But not as long as Senator Escobar.
Oh, you are the longest serving.
longest, yes.
Longest serving, that is
I
true.
know, it's a lot of years.
Super minority
Sorry.
leader. That's what we'll give you the title now, super minority leader. Talk about how that's happened over the years, how the number of those bills has continued to climb.
I think it's also a reflection of the growth in our state. I mean, we are, we're growing, one of the fastest growing economies in the nation, or the fastest growing economy in the nation, plus our population, our needs are changing. We went through a pandemic. I mean, the needs are just different. At the same time, the days that we serve are the same. And I think we need to recognize that it's humanly impossible to review 1,500 bills, which is how many were open or filed, I guess, not necessarily all of them drafted. But that as we continue to see more of those numbers, it's just the challenge is going to be the same. So our own human powers of 24 hours a day is going to limit the amount of bills that we pass. I mean, realistically. And the only concern is how much do we actually dedicate on each bill to have some discussions. Some bills take hours and hours of our time collectively as a group of legislators, and then others may fly really fast and we may miss something, right? And that's why we come every year and we learn, because we have to live with what we pass, all of us, on our daily life. The day after the session, we leave the session, some of them get, to start implementation right away, and that's when you're like, oops, like, we missed this one. So it is the nature of, I guess, the beast, but part of it is we're growing. I mean, I think it's growing pains as well.
Mm-hmm. There tends to sometimes to be a theme that seems to emerge during each legislative session. Maybe we'll go down the line and see what you saw as a major theme, particularly through the lens of students here in the state of Utah. Senator Milner, you have such great experience, but as a former president of Weber State University, too, you have a very unique perspective on legislation.
Probably so. I mean, education is always a theme. If I poll that every year with my constituency, education comes out at the top. So it's an important topic in the state. But what's been interesting the last 2 years is that water has topped education, which is like just a general polling of constituents in my area. And I think the drought that we've been through the last few years, fortunately last year and this year, we're a much better place. But it has us focused, I think, as a state on thinking through how we're going to meet our long-term water needs in the state. The other one that's also starting to emerge is how are we going to meet our long-term energy needs in the state? We have kind of depended on our power companies to make sure that we have the power we need to serve the needs of the state. But as we see the transition in forms of and sources of energy, as we see the growth in our population, back to what Senator Escamilla said, that growth is challenging us now because we're growing faster than we've ever grown before. And so energy became another very large topic. And then I think a big one was also, and I have a bias here, but thinking about our economic growth and how we continue to steer that in the right way, how we continue to make sure we have the workforce for it. So those are 4 pretty important themes I saw. I'm sure others will have some other thoughts too.
Yeah, please. We'll break these down in a minute, but let's go down and hear some.
For me, and again, I think it depends on the areas that you're working. Certainly mental health, mental behavioral health. We are revamping our entire infrastructure as a state, doing some incredible work. Some of it happening here at the University of Utah with the Huntsman Mental Health Institute, but it's a full-blown statewide, policy reform. So we started that process, including OPLR and our access to professionals. It has to do with all of you because, we were graduating students, for example, psychology, at a huge rate, and none of them were practicing actually on the work they went to school for. So part of it is our licensure process. So it's everything, revamping mental behavioral health. Housing continues to be a priority. I think it is obviously for our younger generations, their ability to pursue the American dream of own your own home. That's been a focus for the last couple of years. Homelessness, which obviously, individuals that are on shelter or experiencing homelessness ties back to access to housing and that piece of homelessness. And childcare, which is my number 1 priority. I think it's something that our families are certainly seeking help, and it's something we've been trying to raise awareness.
Representative Romero?
Well, I don't want to be the downer here, but I think this was probably the toughest session for me, and I've served in the legislature for 12 years. And I think we have maybe different perspectives on how we handled energy and how that ties to climate change. There are some of my colleagues, and I'm not saying anyone here on the panel, that don't believe that climate change exists. And the pissing match we had with the federal government on energy regulation. So I'm really concerned about that, and I'm really concerned on how that's going to impact us later on as ratepayers. People say, well, we have the lowest rates in the country, some of the lowest, but what's going to happen when we have to maintain these coal power plants, which we're going to go out of circulation to begin with. And then people's personal freedoms, I think, depending on how you look at it, the right to be able to use the bathroom you want to was taken away from you. And more importantly, what we talked about on college campuses, which was diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'm a product of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we definitely have different perspectives on that. But I think those three themes kind of hovered over our legislative session. And at times, because of some of the cultural wars tied with it, we didn't get to talk about important policy like clean air, affordable housing, how are we going to help people experiencing homelessness, and how are we going to make sure that all Utahns feel welcome?
Thanks. Representative Moss.
Yeah, I'll just add to some of the comments. And I think what we looked at, some of the things we did this year that I think were a little unique is how we addressed some of these issues. So for instance, with homelessness, affordable housing, that was one that Representative Spenlup came up with a very different approach, right? We've tried to come up with ways to help fund how do we get more people into affordable housing, and we've always looked at it through the lens of either land use, which has been one of the main sources, right? How do we make it more efficient through the city zoning process? I served on a city council, and it used to take a few months, and now it takes a year and a half, and the costs of holding that land and being able to actually get that to a place where you can actually develop it and build houses has taken so much longer, and that adds to the cost. But what Representative Spenlup came up with this year is, again, a pretty unique idea, is the state has this pool of funds called the PTIF. And the state treasurer manages this source of funds. It's about $30 billion. And they put this in, it's kind of, where governments are sitting on cash, or they invested in short-term vehicles. And Representative Spenlup came up with, his background is in banking, and he's on the budget. And as they were trying to figure out how do we put more resources in directly to benefiting the individual, they came up with a new idea of taking $300 million of that and actually putting that to work in our local banks. And saying right now what's happening is more of these larger banks, because there is some concerns in the economy, right? Is this going to continue? And so they're being less willing to lend, especially at the local level. And so putting that money that capital to work, I think, is going to make a huge difference. And then putting some requirements that had to go towards a certain demographic, trying to get more people. Because on the one hand, you have the supply of housing, right? And they did some bills this year around how to streamline and make it more innovative around modular housing, other new types of housing that we've never really seen in the state of Utah. So they're doing that on the supply side. But then when somebody goes out to get a loan, it's really difficult. And so we've got some funding that's, President Adams isn't here, but he put together to help with the down payment, but then providing more access to capital for individuals. So I think that was a really unique approach that we tried this year.
Thank you for that. I want to go into some of these key points. One is with the kind of the principles. You can tell what people prioritize by what they fund. And this was a very interesting year when it comes to the budget. It was a $29 billion budget, the biggest in the history of the state of Utah. That's a pretty serious amount of growth. But when we went into the legislative session, this was Senator Jerry Stevenson, Chair of Executive Appropriations. It was from the first time I saw him, this is a socks and underwear year. All right, so don't get your expectations too high. Is that how we ended up, though? Was it a socks underwear year, or what did you see that was funded that you see as being most impactful? Who would like to start with that one?
I think it was a sock and underwear year for social services and for marginalized communities. But I mean, that's just my perspective. But I think we could have invested more money into people experiencing homelessness and to address homelessness, but we did put some money in, as the good representative pointed out. So for me, my concern is the money we're taking away from public education as well and put it into the Utah Fit scholarships. If all of you don't know that, we passed a kind of like a voucher bill last year. And then we put a lot of money into that, and then we put more money into that, even though the program hasn't even started. And so I think like if I was in charge of the budget, I would have probably prioritized a little bit different.
Senator.
So just a different viewpoint on that, and that is that if you look at the money we put in education this year, we put over $800 million into public education this year. And that's a new, I mean, that may not be the highest because last year may have been the highest because we actually had more money last year. It seems strange, but we had more money last year because we had more federal money to be able to help meet some of the needs that we had out there. This year, though, we put a record number in terms of thinking about money for education to support our schools throughout the state. Some of us have been around for a long time. Before I was serving in the legislature, I got to go down and beg at the legislature. And I know that feeling. So, and I have to tell you, there were times that public education was just begging for like 2 WPU. And sometimes that was even hard to get. This year they got 5. Last year they got 8. I mean, it's a very different time for public education. But as we grow as a state, it can't just be education. We do have to invest in homelessness, and that's a statewide need now. It's not just a Salt Lake need. It's a statewide need. In my community, the Lantern House has had challenges in that area for a very long time. We want to make sure we're providing the right kind of facilities in the right place. And I have to say, Wayne Niederhauser, I think, is doing a very thoughtful job of really trying to say, how do we do this in the right way? It's not something, it's something we can try to say, can we do this in a way that we can help people when they really need it, but they need more than just a place to stay. Many of them need support for mental health, for drugs, for other kinds of things. Let's don't just make this a program that's just about trying to find them a roof over their heads. Let's try to help them get out of this and get back on their feet. And I think he's really trying to think through that. And then that means you've got to have some deeply affordable housing out there, but a place that can also support them and help them, that it's not just putting them in that place. We are making progress. We are investing significant amounts of money in that. And if some of you may have been around when the Rio Grande project happened, what was that?
8 years.
8 years ago.
Yeah, we didn't support it though because it blew into our neighborhoods with the prison.
Okay, so, but I'm just saying, before that, the state put no money in to that at all. Anything, absolutely nothing. 8 years later, I think we put $60 million of state money into trying to help deal with homelessness and then work on affordable housing. So we're just a state that's growing rapidly and has a wide range of needs and is going to have to think about what we need right now, but strategically what we need in the long term as well. And that's going to be the basics of life. Infrastructure related to roads, related to water, related to energy. We can't continue to grow as a state unless we get thoughtful about addressing those for the long term. You have to stop and think about the people who came in and settled this valley. And there was, the weather conditions were probably pretty much the same as they are today, because that was 175 years ago, okay? But what they did is say, well, they went up and they started building reservoirs to help meet our need. They built more reservoir capacity than they ever needed for themselves. They were building for generations to come. We have to start building for generations to come, and that's harder for us to do. We like to meet immediate needs, but we've got to think about children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who will come after us.
Yeah, so maybe for the group, the exercise of the budget is unique, and let me explain, because the Senate, for example, the Senate president holds a media briefing every day. So for 45 days, the Senate majority, and they invite the minority, the leader, or a representative from our caucus to participate. And that gives you get a chance to see the progress. And part of the conversation, so just so people are aware, the senator is correct to say last year we had a $29.7 billion budget. This year was $29.4 billion. There's a difference, not a huge difference, but when we started, we have to keep in mind, we don't know the numbers, so we start our session on estimates. I think that's a fair assessment of this conversation because Senator Jerry Stevenson, that's our chair for executive appropriations in the Senate, and has been doing a great job on this, which is the toughest job of the whole thing, because we have to balance our budget. We're not Washington, right? So we have to balance our budget. We cannot overspend, and we won't. We're working with estimates that come from our governor, our own fiscal analyst office. We have like 40 staff people, economists, many of them graduated from this great institution. And then the governor's office of budget, so Jason knows this because he was the chief of staff for the whole team. And then they come together and with the tax commission, they are like, okay, this is what we think we're gonna get. And we're just estimating. So in fairness, we did start with an estimate that looked way lower than last year. That is a fair assessment. So when Senator Stevenson was saying socks and underwear, I think he was right on saying, hey, let's be conservative. We're not gonna go crazy because we may not have the money, and we're gonna have to make sure we're being cautious as we are processing our appropriation process where all of us participate, the 104 members, through committees. So I can tell you in Social Services Appropriations Committee, our exercise is painful because we set an amount that we think we're gonna have and then we just go for it. And that's cutting program, I mean, it's just brutal. It's probably the hardest committee you can serve on appropriations. You're gonna cry because you're gonna cry. You're cutting between feeding a child for reals, like feeding like a tubing feed, or autism services. I mean, those are the decisions, what goes first. And then of course you have every other committee, right? Transportation, IGG, the buildings, higher ed, public ed. So all of that is happening, and then executive appropriations, which is leadership, and I think this is to the comment that Minority Leader Romero said, where, you know, as members of the minority party, we have some limited ability on what we intervene on those processes, and it's a fair conversation. We just need to be very blunt about it and clear. We've survived like that for many years. It's tough. Those decisions of prioritization take place. But towards the end, by almost the end of February is when we knew. So keep in mind, our session ended on March the 2nd. It was probably 1 week when we actually knew the real numbers. So I just want to premise that because, you know, in fairness, it sounds like, oh, you guys been dramatizing about the socks and underwear, and at the end you had all this money. Now, if you ask me personally, I am beyond sad and frustrated and upset that we couldn't fund anything on childcare. I want to cry right now. I'm going to start therapy next week, like for reals. Because I can't believe we had $29.4 billion and we couldn't fund anything on childcare. So to me, it was a devastating session from that perspective. We had all these other pieces happening. I think the good senator explained, right? I mean, we have to look ahead on infrastructure for water. We've been building infrastructure in the last couple of years on transportation because it's needed because we have no other choice, right? Schools, you're talking now about buildings, security. So anyways, I just wanted to put that whole perspective because it is a unique, people are listening and like, what do you guys mean by socks and underwear? And how come you end up almost with the same? I'm getting my constituents upset. It's like, you told us there was no money and now come back and you have $29.4 billion, what happened? So I just want to explain that as a perspective.
Well, maybe I can add a little on the budget side. I actually did the budget. I was on there for 3 years as the vice chair of the budget, and I had the unfortunate experience of having to go through the pandemic when I was on the budget, and that was a really rough time. You know, we came in with 1.6 billion of new money. And then within about a month, I think I ran a bill that said we're wiping all of that out. This was before they had federal money. The one thing I would say about our state is that we are trying to be conservative in terms of our estimates. And so, you know, when we started to see all this pandemic, you know, federal money that was coming in, obviously our revenues were really good. But there was always this risk or concern. And a lot of states just basically said, hey, this is great, this is the new normal. And Utah said, we don't really think that's the case. We think this is really more of of a result of all of this federal stimulus money. And so we actually were pretty conservative for a few years. And I think that paid off pretty well for us. A lot of states right now are going through serious budget cuts. There's states with massive deficits. California, I heard it was like $80 billion that they're having deficits right now. And Utah, fortunately, was able to weather the storm a little better because we do be a little more conservative. We take money that they might think is ongoing money, right? It's new revenues, and they'll say, we just don't think this is real, and so we'll pull some of that aside and say, this is kind of more high-risk funding that if this money doesn't materialize, we know we don't have to depend on it. So rather than having to come back and make cuts, we're able to do that. The other thing I think is important to note is how we do our budgeting process is pretty unique in Utah. I think we're one of the only states in the country that actually has every member of the legislature. Senator Escamilla was talking about being on the social services budget. In most states, they just have a small group of leadership that says, we're going to decide exactly where that money goes. And in Utah, we have a really cool, I think it's a really good thing that we do, where every member gets to have a say in that, right? Every member gets to serve on appropriations committee. It might not always go the way you want it to go, but at least you have more of a voice. And I'll say that's across party lines. Yeah. We have Republicans who feel the same way, that they don't get everything that they want. So I think that's also a really cool thing that Utah does. In terms of some of the budget things this year, I was a little surprised, I'll be honest. I'm in higher education, as is Senator Milner, and there was a lot of angst about higher ed. I didn't think we were going to do a lot of stuff for higher ed, and the fact that we were able to get the $75 million building was a huge deal, the Huntsman Cancer Institute. I had kind of a unique situation. I was already supportive of this. I think it's very needed. I live in Utah County, and I thought that would be a good benefit. During the session, my mother-in-law got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and she actually lives in rural Utah, down in Ephraim. And so when we were talking about this building, it became very personal to me, that for somebody who lives south, right, rather than having to drive all the way to Salt Lake, the fact that now she, when we get this building built, can come to Utah County is a massive benefit for that area. And I think also for the economic development of the state. Huntsman's doing some amazing research, and the fact that we're also coupling that in with some of the commercialization things that Senator Milner's doing, Utah can really be a leader. We already are, but continue to be a leader in innovation around healthcare. And so that's some of the things I thought were really cool that we did this session.
All right, thank you for that. I want to get to a couple bills that were passed and discussed. For our students, I know that we have a lot are talking about the DEI bill. It's already been mentioned here by a couple of you. Let's go into that one for a minute, what it does and some of those discussions. Who wants to take that one first? Because it does directly impact not just higher ed, but also public ed.
And local institutes.
And
all government.
Entities.
all
government.
institutes, yes, correct.
All governmental entities. I mean, I can try, so I can try because it's a confusing bill. It's a very robust bill. It's fair to say that higher ed participated in conversations for about 9 months. I think that's something that took place, and that should be acknowledged. And if you look at the bill from a very policy, just implementation perspective, and I'm talking now as a practitioner, former student here from the MPA program in political science. From a policy side, if you look at the higher ed portion, because I separated higher ed, K-12, public ed, and then governmental entities, higher ed was like pristine drafting, meaning that thing was worked. And I think it's going to reflect better in terms of outcomes for higher ed. So I have to say, probably higher ed in terms of the practical piece will come out of the experience of this bill on the policy piece and the implementation way better than K-12, public ed, and then governmental entities. Because those two were added 4 days before the beginning of the session. That's our understanding. So, because we were not part of those conversations. So I mean, by say we, meaning the minority caucuses and leadership. So now in terms of the policy, this is a national movement, which makes it really hard because it comes into this cultural divisiveness. And the governmental entity, and now I'm going to speak like red flags, because there's like a lot of concerns, but then massive red flags is public health. So if I have any public health experts here or students in public health, you're going to understand public health by definition is the idea of closing gaps, whatever that looks like. That's what public health does. And I've worked in that field before. I work in a hospital. I've done that before. So when you are removing opportunities for distinction based on whatever those are, so race, ethnicity, gender. You're now creating, we're going backwards in terms of moving forwards with some of the public health pieces. I think the governor, in fairness to the governor, and both Representative Romero and myself had lengthy conversations, he'll be the one implementing at state level, and then all the local health departments. We had conversations on how this looks like without violating Title VI, Title VII, and Title IX. Which those are federal laws that supersede state law. So just the implementation alone is going to be a nightmare. You're going to ask, well, what does it do? So one, it removes the wording diversity, equity, and inclusion. And words are words. They have meaning and they have a message. But let me remove the wording piece into removing all training related to diversity. And this is where I think we get into semantics of words. What does diversity mean? Who defines it? It's not defined in statute. I would have loved to have it defined in statute, because at least then it gives clear guidance to agencies on what they have to do, or universities or schools. That's not defined, so that's going to be one problem. And then two, just impact to groups. So one of the things we were talking about is, because I've been part of those conversations on addressing issues of social determinants of health and closing gaps of health on, for example, African Americans and the sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease impacts 95% of Blacks and African Americans. If you're not focused on that community, you lost it. Like, why are we even having a conversation about it? So those are the things that I've had personally concerns. And then there's the message issue behind the bill, and I'll let someone else take on that one. But for me, that was the policy concerns I had on the bill.
We both have MPAs from here at the University of Utah, just so people know our backgrounds, because a lot of times people look at us and they don't realize we both have master's degrees. Even people we serve with that don't have master's degrees. But I don't know if you wanted to add on to the messaging. I don't know if the Republicans want to.
Do you want,
Yeah,
I'm
go ahead.
willing.
Yeah, either one I can, or you, go ahead.
So I think there's a fair point that Senator Escamilla made, that higher ed had the opportunity to work on that bill for a lot longer time, perhaps than public ed did and local government. On the other hand, I know what we do in the legislature, what our process is sometimes we don't get it right the first time. And I'm going to guess that we're going to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And in the next legislative session, we will be modifying to make this work. Let me tell you that I think, at least from a higher ed perspective, this comes from people wanting higher education institutions to have a place where diverse viewpoints can be brought, where people can have conversation, they can engage in discussion. And there are many people out there who feel that we have moved past that point, that we are in a point that you have to have a certain mindset and viewpoint in higher ed, and that there are others who don't, and they either feel like they have to be out of the environment or they have to go quiet in the environment. If you go back to the founding of higher education, and it's kind of interesting in that we come back a lot to the academic freedom piece, and it should be a marketplace of ideas. It should be a place where people can come and debate, whether they can disagree, they can disagree vigorously, but respectfully. And there not be an expectation that everybody believes and says the same thing. And the feeling by some is that we've lost that environment. For any of you who have some interest in seeing that this isn't just a Utah phenomenon, it has become something I think the questions are being asked all across this country. Go to something called Heterodoxy Academy. Go out there. It's a group of actually probably formed by Democrats on college campuses who said, we are moving away from being able to have a diversity of viewpoints expressed on our campuses, and we need to get back to that environment. Go to the University of Chicago has had a statement for a very long time about creating the kind of environment on our campuses where we could have lots of debate. That's the environment. A marketplace of ideas, a public square should be what we're creating on our campuses. So that has to do with the viewpoint piece. The other has to do, we should be helping every student succeed on our campus. I believe that. I believe that every student is a little bit different. Every student learns differently. Every student comes from a different background. Every student has things that probably have helped them, but things that are struggles for them. We should be focused on our campuses and saying, how do we help every student succeed? And that really is what the point of this was about. Let's help every student succeed on our campus.
But the message that was given out to people, let's erase people. That's the message I heard. That's the message most people in my community heard, is we're going to erase you because we're all the same. And we're not all the same.
No, we're
If
not.
you look at the history of the United States of America and you look at racism and how it's embedded in the social fabric, and this is my academic side coming out, and yes, we all grew up different. We all had different lived experiences. I grew up in Utah, Jeff grew up in Utah, but I can tell you, by the time I was in kindergarten, I knew that I was different because of my ethnicity, more so than my gender, because people made me know that I was a spick or I was a dirty Mexican, even though my family's been here longer than probably everyone in this room, because I'm indigenous and I'm also Mexican American, and I was Catholic. So growing up in Utah, I'm 50, that wasn't that long ago, wasn't an easy task. So when you put out messages saying we're all the same, what you're telling people is like, you don't matter, we're erasing you. From my perspective, again, not everyone has to agree with me. I think that's the beauty of disagreeing. But when I'm a first-generation college student. When I came up here to the University of Utah, the reason why, and I dropped out, had a kid and came back, but the reason why I graduated was because of the Center for Ethnic Student Affairs. Because I knew that was going to be a place where people understood who I was, understood my backgrounds, because there was a counselor there who had a similar story as mine. And because of that center, I met community leaders like Archie Archuleta and Pete Suazo, who was the first Latino elected into the Senate and I interned for him. And I met him here on this college campus because of the Center for Ethnic Student Affairs, and he got me involved in community organizing. So to strip away people's identities, and I know people say, oh, we shouldn't have identity politics. Well, I'm sorry. Identity politics is played all the time in our lives. Just like people say, oh, we don't have to talk about politics. We always talk about politics. So the message that was given to people who think like me, and I can tell you, majority of my community, many think like me. I'm the president of the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators, which includes Commonwealth. If you look at the demographics of the people involved, regardless if you're Colombian, Puerto Rican, most of us are Democrat. So when people say the Latino vote is going to the Republican Party, I'm sorry, wake up, because that's not happening. And it's because of bills like this. Yes, it's a national movement, because it's a national movement to erase people. And I think we have to think about, as legislators, the message we're sending out to people. And the conversations that were had at times were heartbreaking for me, because it was just a message. And I can tell you, there are many people in my community, and Senator Escamilla, because we overlap a lot, that feel like they don't know what they're going to do. They don't know what resources to use because they're already vulnerable and marginalized. So yeah, maybe in policy-wise, when it comes to the university, the funding hasn't changed, and we're going to have student support centers. But what we've done is we've told people, we're all the same. Don't worry about what happened to you in the past, because that's the past. But I'm telling you, those people that serve with me aren't going to the grocery line like me and having someone say, go to where you came from. And I'm like, I am where I came from. So when we pass bills like that, we also exert hate. And we've seen that with trans youth, and we've seen that with DEI legislation. So I think we have to be very careful when we run legislation, because we're on the wrong side of history here. And I said it today.
Representative
Maybe
Moss?
just a few minutes. I don't want to
Yeah,
go.
and can you add one little component to this, to what
Sure.
Senator Miller talked about, as you do that, if you don't mind? Because one of the requirements in some of the legislation that's passed was a climate survey, of calling it that, of campuses, to find out if students feel like their voices are being suppressed or not, or they feel comfortable without retribution on campus, because that was part of one of the bills.
Well, I think that's important. I mean, here at the University of Utah, there's different groups of folks, and some of our universities, it may be the opposite direction, right? They may have a much more conservative student body, and they may have students that have issues that they feel like they've been pushed the other direction. And I think the idea, and I appreciate Representative Romero, and I've had a lot of conversations, and she's a very dear friend, and I appreciate the sensitivity on this issue, and I do know there's some concern out there with the messaging. I think the intent and really what the bill ultimately was trying to do is to say any discrimination is bad. Anybody that discriminates against any other individual, that should never happen. And I think that should be just human nature. We should believe that. That shouldn't happen. We shouldn't have the things that Representative Romero was talking about. But the point of, I think, the bill was to say, no matter what that viewpoint, whatever that is, we should not discriminate against that. And if you look at it in the light of even some recent Supreme Court cases, around the hiring practice, there were some concerns around that, and saying that you do need to not look at that as a requirement for employment. That was actually already illegal. My brother's an employment attorney, and this is literally what he defends, is if there's any kind of discrimination, they should never allow that to happen. So I think that was what we're trying to do. But I do appreciate the messaging kind of took that approach, and I think there were some things that were said early on that took that narrative. I actually appreciated the debate that happened. I felt like it was pretty respectful in terms of what the intent was. On the climate, though, I think that is important. I think our college students should all feel safe. No matter what their views, whatever their background, they should feel like they're able to express their viewpoint, that they can be able to, whatever background they come from, that they can be who they are and not have to worry, is that going to get them in trouble, or is that going to hurt them in a grade or something? And then with their professors, I think that's also important. I love the fact, I did a political philosophy degree, and it was all about learning from all these different perspectives. And we would literally argue one side of an issue, and then we'd turn around and argue the other side. And it was all about getting that different viewpoint. Sorry, I'm overcoming a cough here. But that, to me, is one of the most important things, is how do we make sure that the students feel safe, that it is a true laboratory where you get to learn more about yourself, you get to define your own views in a safe place, but also where you get exposure to all different types of viewpoints.
Thanks for that. We got time for one or two or three questions. Gabby, you got the mic. Who's got the microphone? Right here. Who raised their hand first?
Who has a question?
I saw this hand first, I think. Is that all right? Pretty sure.
All right. Hi, I'm Brennan Mercado. Just a little background. I'm a 40-hour advocate, and I am the philanthropy chair of Beta Theta Pi, where we directly support the Rape Recovery Center. With that being said, what bills are you passionate about this past legislature to help fight sexual violence, especially being ranked the 9th state of most reports? How are you fighting that, and especially Representative Romero? I know you fight a lot of those bills. So.
Yeah, I have a bill called affirmative consent that will not be let out of rules. I've talked to the speaker about it, which if you look at studies and you look at research, Utah, like you said, it has higher than the national average. And you'd be surprised, there's some people in the House that fight a lot of my legislation, and I don't think it's because of the legislation. I think it's because it's me, and I'm a Democrat. It's not him. And so sometimes for us to pass our bills, because I feel like our legislature has went more right, it's a little bit, we have to jump through a little bit more hoops. I had a bill called the Rape Crisis Center to legitimize what those are. I passed one last year, and this year was to put standards of care. I have a colleague who's on leadership, who's not here, who tried to kill it, sent it to a committee, and she tried to kill it with her partner in crime, and it passed. And then made it difficult, and it finally passed the day before the session was going to end. And it's unfortunate that we look at personalities, because I may not like Jeff, I do. But if he has a good bill, I'm not going to stand in the way of it. And so do we have to do more when it comes to sexual assault? In particular, yes. We did some great work when it came to child sex abuse. I ran a bill in 2014, which was child sex abuse preventative education. And everyone's like, why did you pass this bill? And I had Elizabeth Smart and Deandra Brown, if you all know who those are, help me. Those two individuals helped me with the bill, and it passed. And they were like, well, you don't have funding. And I'm like, well, we still have it on the books. So this year, we had some great people out there that focused on child sex abuse, and we were able to get $1 million in ongoing funding. $1 million ongoing and 500 one time or something to that effect.
One of them here.
Yes,
Yes.
I pointed to her. Yes. 1.5 ongoing. And
But
so
it is down.
I think that's an important step. And when we do the preventative piece, when it comes to child sex abuse, but we still have a long way to go when it comes to sexual assault. We all are adults, and if we're not prosecuting people for raping people, there are people out there that know that they're not going to get prosecuted, and they're serial rapists. And in most cases, when someone frees, they don't say yes, they don't say no, but that doesn't mean they've given you consent. So we have a long way to go, and that's what we're going to talk about this summer, and putting more funding towards sexual assault. We've done a good job, and we need to do more when it comes to domestic violence, and we've done some with child sex abuse. But sexual assault is huge, and it's a huge issue here in Utah. It's a huge issue on our college campuses. And if we don't have honest conversations about consent and what consent is, and the stereotypes of what affirmative consent is, we're going to continue to. I remember discussing that bill in committee, the one time it went to committee, and people were like, well, in Utah, you know, people have regret sex, and I was just appalled. But that's how people think, and so we have to do something even at, we're starting with child sex abuse in elementary schools, but when we're talking about junior high and high school, we need to do more conversations about what consent is, what it's not, and college campuses, but we also have to hold people accountable. If you don't have consent, that's rape. End of story. So.
Any other comments from the panel before we take one more question?
No,
Okay, thank you for that. Gabby, I didn't see.
Anybody can answer this, but I'm aiming at the two Republicans on the bookends here. So it's difficult to discriminate against the majority, no matter what. It's very difficult. So when you say we want to end all discrimination, most of it comes against those who are not in the establishment majority. Secondly, isn't it difficult to do what you want to do when you have when the demographic of Utah is really whiter than an Osmond family Christmas in Norway? You know, I mean, it's difficult. If this were a more diverse society, you'd probably be right on course. But it doesn't quite work as neatly as you think when there's such a huge body that is the majority.
So I can take that in some different ways. Part of my district's Ogden, Utah. That is a minority majority community, if you look at the demographics of that community. But it's the community I serve. And it's really important for me. But one of the things that I learned is I set a focus group of kids, and they were actually Hispanic kids. This has been 15 years ago. I was behind the mirror. And what I heard from those kids is this. We had to fight our families to be able to go to school. Because the expectation for us after high school is that we take care of our family or that we go to work to support our family. And we kind of had to break with that. I have to admit that put me back on my heels because I probably didn't have enough cultural understanding about the support system that was needed to support those students. But every one of those students was also different and had a different story and had different needs. And I think we have to be much more focused on the individual student and what their needs are. I'm not sure we serve people by grouping. We need to focus on individual students and helping every student succeed. That's harder. That's actually much harder work than thinking about how I can put you in groups, to think about individualizing everything we do. But I think that's where we need to go as a state if we're going to be able. I look at what's going on in public schools, et cetera. We're not serving the needs of each individual student. We've got to figure out how to break through and do that. And until we do that, I don't think we can help every student succeed.
Any last comment?
Oh, good.
All right. We're going to have to wrap up this particular forum. Having known these four great legislators for a very long time, I hope you take note of the model of discourse from them. You can disagree significantly on issues and still be respectful in that disagreement, which is an important model. Appreciate you all for doing that, which you always
We wish
do.
all our colleagues felt that way, because we would ban some people from X right now, if I could.
On both sides.
On both sides, or both sides.
Just to be clear.
An easy thing to do is just
we
not
will
get on it.
Yes.
We all need to sign off now.
I keep trying to tell my colleagues, do what I do, sign off.
It's true. And to all of you, these great students here at the University of Utah and our community members, stay engaged. That's what we saw this session. We need every one of you engaged every time.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
Every time I come here and I think about the Hinckley Institute, I think about the Hinckley family. I just have to say, this has been around for a long time. The Hinckley family, they were in Salt Lake, they were in Ogden, they were in different businesses. But a very long time ago, they did 2 or 3 things. One of those is they said, we need to help make sure we create a political environment and where students can talk and have a discussion about diverse ideas and a place to do that, and also to help people gain the skills that they need to be able to engage in the process. They also did a scholarship program that they benefit every school in the state of Utah and students that are here. I just want to encourage all of us to think that way. How do we think about the long term? How do we be people like? And we talked about Huntsman's here. We can talk about Hinckley. But sometimes it's easy to forget that this was started by people a very long time ago to benefit each and every one of you for generations to come. And we should thank them for that support.
Perfect.
1994.
Yes, go Hinckley
We interned
Interns.
1994.
Let's give a hand to these great panelists. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. I have some gifts for you. Okay, everyone, go do great things. We're all counting on you.